In the last episode, I made the point that God equipped people to image Him on earth. He did that by sharing His attributes, in this case His qualities and abilities, with them. As wonderful as that was, it is also where things get interesting and scary. One of God's qualities is freedom, what we call free will. If you've ever wondered why there's evil in the world, here's the biblical answer. When God made the decision to share His attributes with His children, He knew what it meant. God knows everything, so He understood clearly what would happen. God had made the same decision earlier with the heavenly family He had created. They have abilities like intelligence and freedom too. They got those gifts from their Creator. God knew that sooner or later His gifts would be either misused or abused. He knew full well that though His children, in the spiritual world and on earth, were like Him, they were not Him. In other words, they were less than Him. They were imperfect, whereas God is perfect. It is inevitable that at some point His children would either make a horrible mistake or act in thoughtless self-interest, rebelling against something God wanted done or not done. That's precisely what happened in the Garden of Eden. The archetypal high priest that stood between God and the rest of humanity, localized in the Persian Gulf roughly 70,000 years ago, were Adam and Eve. They failed and rebelled by violating God's command to not eat from one of the trees in the garden. This is ancient Near Eastern vocabulary for idolatry. As Paul says about Adam and Eve, quote, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God, nor gave thanks to Him. Instead, their thoughts turned to worthless things, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Though claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images that looked like mortal human beings, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles." Thus, since they sinned, they and the rest of the humans were cast out of God's presence, and every human born thereafter was born outside Eden, estranged from God. Paul again summed it up well. The wages of sin is death. But how did this tragedy start? It was brought on by an earlier rebellion, where one of God's supernatural children decided to dishonor God's decision to have a natural family by tempting Eve. This supernatural rebel's logic was fueled by the hope that God would be tricked into destroying His natural family. This is why He is described as, quote, "the Shining One," and, quote, "more clever than any animal of the field that the Lord God had made." Though He succeeded in getting Adam and Eve to sin, He still failed when it came to getting rid of humanity permanently. There are some deep truths here, the first of which answers a question everyone asks at some point in life. Why is there evil in the world? Evil exists in the world because God decided He wanted to create beings like Himself. I don't mean that God has an evil side. Rather, I mean that God rejected the idea of creating humans as robots or pre-programmed computers made of flesh. That last point is important. Our likeness to Him had to be authentic. Without the genuine freedom to make real decisions, we simply would not be like God. In other words, God is obviously not an automaton machine with apathetic, unemotional calculations. If He was, then how could we be like Him? Thus, without genuine free will, we cannot authentically love God or obey God. If decisions are pre-programmed, they aren't really decisions. For decisions like love and obedience to be authentic, they must be made against a truly possible alternative. The result of all this is that evil exists because people abuse God's wonderful gift of freedom and use it for self-gratification, revenge, and the mirage of autonomy. This abuse began in Eden. But God was not taken by surprise. He had anticipated evil. He foresaw what would happen and planned accordingly. God did not destroy his human children for their rebellion. Instead, he would forgive and redeem them. God saw what was coming and had a plan of forgiveness and salvation in place before the rebellion even happened. In other words, he planned this before the creation of the universe. The plan of salvation would ultimately require God becoming a man. Why? Because there was a price to pay for what happened in Eden. Since God banished humanity from his presence, Eden was no more. Instead of life with God their Father, humanity would now look forward to death. That's what separation from the source of life, in this case God, ultimately costs. In effect, God kicked his children out of his house. But that was a better outcome than what the Shining One had hoped for: human destruction. God wasn't giving up on his plan to have a human family, but rebellion had a cost. God also punished the Shining One. Having brought death into God's world, he would be cast into the realm of the dead. You might wonder at this point why God didn't just scrap the whole plan for having a human family. After all, God allowed free will, knowing it would lead to sin and thousands of years of human misery in the form of violence, neglect, selfishness, and a host of other awful things humans are capable of inflicting on one another. Perhaps your own suffering, or the suffering you see all around you, might even make you wish God had just destroyed everything. Believe it or not, God understands that feeling. He sees the evils you see and infinitely more. None of it is the way he wanted things. But you say, he's God. Can't he just overrule it, all of it? It's not that simple. Think about it. God can only eliminate evil in our world if he eliminates all the ones who do evil. In other words, God can only end evil if he wipes out all of us. As Paul says, quote, "Not even one person is righteous. No one understands. No one searches for God. All have turned away. They have become completely worthless. No one shows kindness, not even one person. Their throats are open graves. With their tongues they deceive. The venom of poisonous snakes is under their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. They run swiftly to shed blood. Ruin and misery characterize their lives. They have not learned the paths to peace. They don't fear God, for there is no distinction among people, since all have sinned and continue to fall short of God's glory." So yes, God could end evil, but he doesn't. He loves humanity too much for that to be an option. All this boils down to an amazing truth. In other words, while God knew what making us like him would lead to, this result was preferable than not having a natural family at all. God sees the sin and misery in our world and knows its cause. It hurts him. But God is also so consumed with love for his natural children that he will not turn away from his original ambition. There's no plan B. There has always been plan A. Despite foreseeing the rebellion that would come in Eden and all the failures and sins that would follow, including our own, God still longs for a natural family. Thus, what happened in Eden was only the beginning of the story. God had kicked humanity out of his house. He cursed the Shining One and cast him away from his presence. The message was forceful and simple. Rebellion would be punished. You'd think everyone would get the message. Not even close. Things got even worse. Thus, you may have heard somewhere along the way that the Bible teaches the world has so much evil in it because of humanity's fall into sin in Eden. That's only partially true. After the tragedy of Eden, there were 2 more episodes that plunged humanity further into the depths of depravity and chaos. The first of these is described in Genesis 6:1-4, arguably one of the stranger incidents in the entire Bible. The story is about how some of God's supernatural children, the divine beings, wanted to imitate God by producing their own natural children to the image themselves. They decided to use human women for that purpose. This made them rivals to God, their own Heavenly Father. Rather than be happy with God's desire to have humans become members of their family, they decided they wanted to be overlords of their own humans. That wasn't what God had in mind. God wanted a family, not slaves. These angels that sinned transgressed the boundary between heaven and earth. They did not keep their own position, but abandoned their assigned place. As a result, God threw them into the lowest hell and imprisoned them in chains of deepest darkness, holding them for judgment. But the deed was done, and it had disastrous consequences. Quote, "The Lord saw that human evil was growing more and more throughout the earth, with every inclination of people's thoughts becoming only evil on a continuous basis. Then the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and he was deeply grieved about that." Think about that. Every intention in everyone's heart was only evil continually. As a result, God regretted that he had made humanity. The thought grieved him. This is the very definition of depravity and the sorrow it brings. The first supernatural rebellion led to humanity losing life with God, which is bad enough. This second supernatural rebellion took the effects of sin to another level, accelerating human self-destruction. God felt deep remorse over the way things had turned out. Humanity had been permanently damaged. As a result, an epic Persian Gulf flood occurred roughly 12,000 years ago. Coincidentally, if you're an atheist, or providentially if you're a theist, that wiped out the sin in this region. Notice that this flood story never says God was angry. It only says he was heart-stricken over what was going on. God had decided to give humans freedom. He couldn't take it away, since doing so would mean they would no longer be like him. They'd no longer be truly human. The only choice was to start over and put an end to what the rebellious divine beings had caused. Only one man was said to be righteous in God's eyes, Noah. At least there was one. God would take it. He would move ahead with his plan to have a natural family. God told Noah to, quote, "Make for yourself a vessel of stalks from a reed hut. With reeds you will make the vessel and tar it inside and out with bitumen." Late Pleistocene and early Holocene humans in the Persian Gulf were known for coracle reed boats. Thus, Noah built a reed house so that he, his family, and his farm animals would survive. But God still held out hope that, as deep as human depravity had become, that his natural children could be with him. Mercifully, he made Noah tell people what was going to happen so that they could turn from their depravity and be forgiven. In the end, people wouldn't listen. They refused God's gracious warning. Once again, God's natural children turned their backs to him as they were free to do. Is it any wonder God's heart was so broken? At least there was Noah and his family. After the flood, God repeated the original commands he had given to Adam and Eve. Quote, "Be productive, multiply, and fill the earth." God was starting over with them. He made a covenant with Noah that extended to all humanity. A covenant is a promise or pledge. This covenant was one-sided. It was all about God's promise to never destroy humanity. Amazingly, God still wanted a natural family. But, as you might have guessed, the abuse of God's goodness would continue, and soon a third rebellion followed after the epic Persian Gulf flood. In fact, this will frame the rest of the biblical story and again show God's unconquerable patience and love. Thus, you may have heard of the Tower of Babel. If not, that's okay, because even most churchgoers don't realize what really happened there. The story of the Tower of Babel is found in Genesis 11:1-9. After the Persian Gulf flood, God wanted Noah's descendants to multiply and spread out over the earth. Like the high priests Adam and Eve, they were to be God's co-workers to maintain creation. Instead of doing that, they gathered at a place called Babel and built a tower to their own glory. That's the familiar version of the story, but its real significance is found elsewhere. Quote, "Remember the days of old. Reflect on the years of previous generations. Ask your father and he'll tell you. Your elders will inform you. When the Most High gave nations as their inheritance, when he separated the human race, he set boundaries for the people according to the number of the children of God. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted portion." This is part of the Song of Moses, his last words before he died. These verses tell us that one of the judgments at the Tower of Babel was the division of humanity. Up until this point in the story, God was dealing with humanity as a collective whole. That changed at Babel. Humans would be segregated by language and geography. Even worse, it appeared that God fully divorced himself from humanity. Fed up with human defiance of his will, God assigned the nations of the earth to other members of his supernatural family, the quote-unquote children of God. This was a different group than those who transgressed before the Persian Gulf flood. God couldn't kick humanity out of his house. He had done that already back in Eden. He had promised not to destroy humanity after the flood, so there would be no repeat of that disaster. So, what else could God do? He essentially said, "Enough. If you don't want me to be your God, I'll assign you to some of my heavenly assistants." The fallout of this judgment took many forms. We aren't told how long it took, but the supernatural family of God assigned over the nations did a lousy job. They became so corrupt that God had to judge them too. He would one day take away their immortality and take back the nations. Thus, notice that God's frustration left him childless in terms of having a natural family. In other words, it appeared that he gave up. Is this completely true? Well, not exactly. Guess what happened right after the Tower of Babel catastrophe? God appeared to Abraham, an old man married to Sarah, who was also beyond the age where she could have children. God made a covenant with Abraham. He promised the old man and his wife that they would have a son. God would do a miracle. Their son would be the beginning of a new family for God on earth. Having allotted humanity to the oversight of members of his heavenly host, God wanted to begin anew with a family of his own with Abraham, and Abraham believed God's promises. He didn't have to earn God's interest or favor. It was God who had chosen Abraham to start over. The relationship between God and Abraham started with God, and Abraham believed. Afterward, the covenant relationship that began with God's call and Abraham's faith was commemorated with the physical sign of circumcision. Abraham's entire family followed his example. Bearing the sign marked the descendants of Abraham as the children whom God wanted as his family. Circumcision would be a sign to the women of Abraham's lineage too. Since they were to marry only within the extended tribe, they would be reminded of how their people had been supernaturally created from Abraham and Sarah when they decided to have their own children. It's important to realize that God's covenant with Abraham was based on belief in God's promises. In other words, they had faith. God didn't approach Abraham because he had found a man who was a good rule keeper. Salvation is not based on behavior. We cannot earn our salvation. If that was the case, then God would be in our debt by virtue of our performance. He'd owe us something in response to our achievement. Think of how absurd that sounds. Rather, Abraham and his descendants showed their belief in God's promises by observing the sign of the covenant. It was an outward way to show where their loyalty was. Paul used Abraham as an example of believing loyalty. Abraham believed and was accepted by God before he obeyed any rules. The rules were about showing he believed. They did not replace belief, because belief was the one essential thing. Promising Abraham a son, and through him the start of a new family that would grow into a great nation, was God's second covenant after the disaster of Eden. The first covenant had been with Noah. Both were designed to preserve his dream of having a natural family. But these covenants weren't just about God not giving up. They were also about extending the offer of eternal life to people. God had not given up on humanity. He couldn't stop loving people. God still wanted a family. God kept his promise to Abraham. He and Sarah did indeed have a son named Isaac. Abraham's extended family would become known as Israel, the name most frequently used in the Old Testament for God's natural family. But what about the people from the other nations, the ones God had assigned to the divine children of God after the Tower of Babel rebellion? They are called Gentiles, a short term that means not from Israel. And despite what happened at Babel, God did not forget about those people. Not only would God start over yet again with a new people, in this case Israel, but he told Abraham that his descendants would someday be a blessing to the other nations God had forsaken. Many years later, Jesus, who was from the family of Abraham, would be the particular descendant who would bring all the nations of the world back to God. Before Jesus arrived on the scene, Gentiles could join God's family by choosing to reject all other gods, believing in him, and taking the sign of God's covenant. A lot of time passed between the time of Abraham and Jesus. Israel's own history as the Lord's portion wasn't a pretty one. They were God's people, but sadly and predictably, their loyalty failed. The darkest hour was still yet to come.